My name is Astro, and the country I chose was England. And what we will dive into today is in regards to their colonization. In other words, we will be diving into the British Empire. While most would go into how the English affected their country, I figured to turn the tables and discuss a little bit on whether or not these countries affected England in turn. But before we get into that, let's talk a tiny bit about England itself. England is a part of the United Kingdom alongside Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Currently, it is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system. Being near the ocean, it has a temperate ocean climate, with one of the biggest factors contributing to that climate is, of course, the ocean's currents. The winters are said to be wet and cool, while the summers are warm in comparison. However, the weather tends to be consistent year-round. The amount of rainfall tends to differ depending on which part of the region, as the southeast is said to be more dry. With that said, the development of the food culture in England narrows down to trade and the developments in its agriculture. The earliest instance of this development starts around 43 AD, which it was the time of Roman Britain, and which was a province during which the Romans conquested or had a conquest over Britain. During this time, the Romans had introduced the British to cherries, stinging needles, as pictured here, which were used in salads, cabbages, peas, and wine. However, this is merely the beginning. During the Middle Ages, there came influences from the Saxons, the Vikings, and the Normans. The Saxons migrating to Britain had brought farming techniques that would help cultivate herbs. Meanwhile, the Vikings invaded, they brought new techniques, such as smoking and drying fish. And while the Normans didn't necessarily introduce anything new, they did influence recipes involving mutton and beef, and they even had a hand in developing the words mutton and beef themselves. The 16th and 17th centuries were the start of early versions of cookbooks being written, which noted a few different recipes involving spices that were starting to be traded around this time, such as cinnamon. Something to note is that the 17th century in particular marked the beginning of the British Empire, and so resources were now starting to diversify due to having imports from these colonies. The 18th century would mark the British agricultural revolution, and many technological advancements were made which improved productivity. An example of one of the innovations was the Norfolk four-course crop rotation system, which is pictured here. And this included crops such as wheat, turnips, barley, and clover. The way it works was that the crops were rotated each season throughout the year, as specific seasons are better for growing certain crops than others. In terms of the modern era, technological advances have only increased, which has reduced the amount of labor. Nowadays, England is able to produce 60% of the country's food. Despite nowadays having its own melting pot of influences from other cultures, a lot of what's considered traditional English cuisine was developed in England itself. Here are some examples, such as Yorkshire pudding, fish and chips, Lancashire hot pot, and the full English breakfast, which does contain black pudding, which you can see here. But circling back to the influences, let's go back to the main topic at hand, and that is the British Empire. The British colonized many countries during its time, spanning multiple continents. In the Western Hemisphere, we have North America, such as the USA and Canada. We have the Caribbean, such as Jamaica and Bermuda, South America, and a few different regions of Africa, which included Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt. In the Eastern Hemisphere, we have the Middle East, with countries such as Israel, Palestine, Iraq, and there was Southern Asian countries such as India, and Eastern countries or territories such as Hong Kong, which is more of a technicality. There was also Australia, New Zealand, and various Polynesian countries. As I mentioned, while the British have culturally influenced the countries they colonized, these colonies have also made their influence as well, specifically in England's food culture. We'll start off with the influences India had on English cuisine. While India was under the British Empire, this was known as the British Raj, and this era lasted from 1858 to 1947. Originally, the impact on the food culture was how spice was one of the things traded. However, over time would also come Anglo-Indian cuisine. The Anglo-Indian people were a mixed race community in India. But anyways, Anglo-Indian cuisine was a type of fusion food mixing Indian and British flavors and was known for its spices. Some examples of this would be kadgiri, and which would become very popular in England, and mulligatawny soup, and I hope I pronounced that right. Something to take note of, as you'll notice, is curry. It's during the British Raj that curry became popular in Britain, with the British making their own variants of it that had flavors that were more along the lines of the usual British palate. And another example of curry being used that isn't necessarily Anglo-Indian is the chicken tikka masala. In fact, in recent years, due to a bit of boom in popularity, chicken tikka restaurants that have served chicken tikka have opened up. So, as you can see, India has probably one of the biggest influences on English cuisine, and you mainly just see this in terms of new flavors as well as curry being introduced into the British diet. Now for the Americans in the audience. With how much we hear about the Revolutionary War and claiming independence, I'm sure there's at least one of you that's wondering if we've also made any sort of influence on the English. To which, in terms of the English food culture, that is both a yes, but also a no. And let me explain why. Back under British rule, we were known as the 13 Colonies, and this rule lasted from 1732 to 1776, in which, in terms of the culinary side of resources, we traded rice, wheat, flour, and dried fish. The reason why I think initially it was hard to tell whether or not we influenced is because, well, our dynamic is arguably one-sided, in the sense of while we've influenced each other culturally, Americans don't exactly perceive British influences as such, and thus kind of just view it as the American default. Meanwhile, the British seem to acknowledge it fairly well. And speaking of the British acknowledging it fairly well, the majority of the American foods that have made it into English food culture tend to kind of have flavors that were more popular in the 1950s, and foods that are normally mainstream, but they but they're more so trends. Burgers, hot dogs, and our more fluffy style pancakes, yeah, those are trends. Some Although there is something to note in that while it's not confirmed, it is theorized that fast food culture over in England was picked up from observing fast food culture over in America, but like I said, that is mainly theorized. Alright, with that said, I thank you for listening. And here are my sources. Thank you.